Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to record the oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm Caesar Carino, your host. And today we have an old-timer from Wadsworth, Joe Arpad, who, well, I guess the white hair and the white beard, the white goatee or the white mustache would make you look older than you are, but you are of vintage years enough to be interviewed for Old Wadsworth.
Okay, all right.
So,
Thank you.
Joe, tell us a little bit about Joe Arpad. I think that I always remember you, but then maybe my memory is faulty or something. Tell me.
I was born in Randolph, Ohio. It's just a township in Portage County. Right after I was born, my aunt came out to make sure I was keeping warm, and she burned the house down. And so we had to move. We moved in with an aunt, and then we moved into Akron for a while. But my father finally, it was during the Depression, 1937, and jobs were very hard to come by. He had worked at the Mohawk Rubber Company. And I would get laid off and get bring back on and so on. And he finally got a steady job with the Cook Coffee Company, selling coffee and other kind of things, tea and mostly hard goods, the kind of thing that a corner store used to do out in the country. Right. And most of the route was here in Medina County and Wayne County. I think he went as far as Creston and some places like that, West Salem. And when the war was coming on, the company said that he had to move closer. He couldn't be driving back to Akron every day. So that's when we moved to Wadsworth.
And how old were you when you moved to Wadsworth?
I was 3 years old.
3 years old. So you've been here essentially all of your life.
Yes.
All of your memories are in Wadsworth, obviously,
course,
because you probably don't remember.
Well, except for one.
The fire, I would imagine.
No, I was too young for that. But when I was growing up in Akron, I remember once seeing a dirigible going over.
Oh, yes.
And I think they call them blimps now, but and there was a neighbor kid, and we got into a big argument because my family was Hungarian, and I was calling it a kielbasa, and
kielbasa.
and he said it was a blimp, and we had gotten a big fight about that.
You thought it was a kielbasa,
yes.
Which of course is a sausage to those people who do not know what a kielbasa is. Where did you move to Wadsworth, and where did your parents move right off the bat?
We moved to Berge Street, and I don't know where. It's about 2 blocks in on East Berge Street. Very nice house. The Foremans lived just up the street from us, Joe Foreman and Jack Foreman, and we played with them. My older brother John, who went to school with you, played with them too.
The Foremans lived on the same side of the street as the Foremans?
Yes, yeah.
So you lived on the north side of the street?
Right, and about 5 or 6 houses from them.
And 5 or 6 houses. Well, you would have lived close to the Hartmans, probably?
Probably.
Brentlingers?
I don't
Motzko's?
Motzko, I remember. He was a barber in town.
Barber, right. Yeah. They all lived in that area.
Right.
What are the names of the kids you do remember when you were growing up there?
Just the Foremans. There were a few others. Zephyr, I think.
Zephyrs? Yeah, a big family of Zephyrs.
He's got a nice website if you ever just want to Google him sometime.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He went to school, I guess, with you, too.
Yes, Pete Zephyr did.
Yes, and he's got a very good reminiscence of Wadsworth on his website.
Oh, I have to look at that.
He talks about walking uptown and not having a car, and from Berge you could walk all over town, and going to the movies and going grocery shopping and all that.
I'll have to look at that. As a matter of fact, I'd like to interview the Webbers. There are a lot of them still around.
Good.
A lot of them are still around. How long did you stay on Berge Street?
Not very long. The war did break out then, and it was 1942. We moved to Broad Street, just right around the corner here.
791.
791 Broad Street. It was a farm at that time yet. The Polks had just built their house next door, and on
the corner of Silver Creek and we have to say these things geographically because it may not be there someday, as you well know. On the corner of Silver Creek and Broad Street, Polk's 805 Broad Street.
Right, and it was Grace, and she's still alive. She's in a nursing home out in...
Grace and Merle.
Yeah, Merle. And they And anyway, it was still a farm, and so we didn't have any running water. We had a pump in the kitchen. We had an outhouse. We had pigs. We had a cow, I think, for a very brief time. And
Despite the fact that you lived on Broad Street.
right in Broad. Well, across the street there was a farm. Fraze's had a farm across the street at that time.
Fraze Farm, yes.
Yeah, and Freed, I think, had a
Freed
farm.
also. The Freed Farm originally was on the corner of Hartman Road and
Yes,
Broad Street, and then that was sold, and they moved. He made a little house there just west of the east of the farm, and then there was a Gillespie family there that lived there too.
That name doesn't sound.
Yeah, they lived in the house between. Well, it'd be the second house down. It would be the Freed Farm, then the Gillespies, and then
Okay.
the house right now, which is the third house, is
Okay.
the one that Corwin Freed built, C-O-R-W-I-N, Freed, F-R-E-E-D,
Yes.
rather than F-R-E-I-D-T. There are two Freeds, and they say them the same, but one is Freed and the other was Freed. This is F-R-E-E-D. And then you lived across the street then.
Yes, and we had very good neighbors, both the Polks and the West. Dennis, or DeForest West.
Forest West, right.
And what was Mrs. West's name? I forget. I'll
Just a second.
get it in a minute.
Yeah, it'll come to us.
Okay. Anyway, he was an executive in Firestone, I believe it was, and or maybe Cyberling, one of the two companies. But and they were they were affluent, but they weren't that affluent. But they were certainly in better economic condition than we were, and they would loan us their car to go places when we needed a car, and they were always very helpful, and Mrs. West always taught me how to use the encyclopedia and things like that. So as someone growing up in a situation which was poverty, we were very fortunate to have good neighbors.
Extreme poverty.
Extreme poverty.
Extreme poverty.
Yeah.
You mentioned your family here. Tell us the brothers and sisters, mother and father, where they were born, and all these other kinds of things.
Okay,
where you come in the family.
Okay. My father was born in 1905. We just celebrated his 100th birthday, even though he died 40 years ago. He was born in Hungary. His father had been in the Austro-Hungarian military for 13 years. And I guess he had just married, and that's when my father came along, and they came to the United States, not because of the usual belief that they wanted freedom and democracy and so on. They wanted to make a lot of money and go back to Hungary and live like middle-class people. And as a consequence, in the Hungarian culture, there's a concept called edge. Edge means one, and you limit yourself to one child so that you can pour all your resources into that child, and then that child's going to advance and then help you in your older age, kind of thing. And so they were planning to train him as to go back to Austria-Hungary and be in the military, and the command language was German. And so when they arrived in Akron, he went to St. Bernard's School, I guess.
There's St. Bernard's Academy.
Yeah.
Sacred Heart Academy at St. Bernard's School.
Okay.
Right.
It was, at that time, it was taught in German.
Right. Sacred Heart Academy was taught in German at that time.
And so that's why he went there. And so as a consequence, he learned many languages during his lifetime. But his father worked for Goodyear, I believe, or one of the companies, tire companies, and he was a mold cleaner. And I don't know if you know much about mold cleaning, but
Well, I'm sure it's not clean.
they use a parting agent, and that time they used talcum. And if you were a mold cleaner, you were breathing talcum all day long. And so at the age of 43, he died of pulmonary problems. So that put a kind of squash on the idea that my father was going to go back, and they were going to go back to Europe. And that's typical of immigrants. They come here to make money, and then something happens, and they get stuck.
They stay here.
They get stuck here, and then suddenly their lives start redefining itself in terms of being an American rather than being a Hungarian. My mother, on the other hand, and so my parents, my grandmother had been operating a boarding house in Akron, and that was pretty typical at that time. And when my grandfather died, my grandmother my father's mother married one of the boarders, and they moved to Homerville, and they bought a farm there with some other people, a 56-acre farm. It's about 2 houses from the little center there in Homerville, if you know where that is.
Homerville is on the western portion of Medina County, and it's in Homer Township.
Right, and he lived there until the 1920s when he met my mother, and they got married. My mother, on the other hand, was born in 1908 in Hungary. She was one of 3 children in this Hungarian village, and the father went off to the United States to make money again, the whole thing again. And so he went to Akron, and the story was that he was womanizing, so my grandmother had to come over and
straighten him out.
Keep him honest. And so she came over, and during the time they were here, and that was about 1910, the war broke out again. The First World War broke out.
13.
And they lost track of the children in Europe. And my mother always told the story about they didn't know there was a war going on until they heard the guns in the woods next door. I mean, we think of the 6 o'clock news and we get all this information. If you were living in a small village in Europe at that time, you didn't have any idea what was going on until it actually hit you. And all during the war, then they lost track. They didn't have any contact with their parents. And the parents didn't know whether they were alive. And in the meantime, they had 2 more.
Well, the children were there, but your grandmother came over to take care of Grandpa.
Right. And so my mother was left with the Roykes, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. And she and Tom and Elizabeth and Teresa were raised there. My mother was the middle, and Teresa was a year older, and Tom was a couple of years younger. And they didn't come then to the United States until 1920, after my grandparents had already had 2 more children, and the American children, as they referred to them, and then they brought the European children back.
So they all were reunited at one time then.
In 1920, and the situation was one of where my Brodich was my mother's maiden name. The American kids were American, and so they were going to go to high school and go to school, but the European kids were European, and so they weren't going to go to school. They were going to go work in the rubber factories and make money. And my mother really didn't like that, and so both she and Teresa married almost immediately when they could.
So they were quite young when they were married.
Yes, and her father had lied on the naturalization papers to make her older so she could go to work, and so she used that to her advantage. She just went out and got married.
Got married instead.
Right, and met with my father. And they had children. First child was Anne, my sister Anne.
Anastasia.
Named after my great-grandmother, Hannah. And you remember Anne, probably.
I remember it as Anastasia.
Oh, really? Okay. And she...
Now, let's get mom and dad's names. John
Pauline,
and Pauline.
Pauline was my mother, John was my father.
Right.
Anne came along, they were married in 25, Anne came along in 26. There was another child, Mary, who came around 1927. She died at 6 months. And then my brother John came along, and he was 1930. And by then we were living in Randolph, or the family was living in Randolph. And then we had another child, Polly, who was born in 1933, and she died, and I was born in 1937, but Polly, during the fire, got some kind of pneumonia or something and died as a consequence of that.
Oh, boy.
So that was the family, Johnny, Ann, me, and then my sister Agnes was born in 1945. My father said that was an afterthought, but they were very happy to
Absolutely.
happy to have
So we
her.
have then living, we have Anne, John, Joe, and Agnes.
No, Ann died in 1988.
Oh, Anne is already gone then.
Yes.
Okay, she's already gone. Now, that
So-
takes care of, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, so we moved to Broad Street, and it was a very good experience there. But it was rough because it was still a farm.
Now, when you say farm, how far back down did it go? It went just about to the...
Right where we are right now, this used to be a farm, I think it was called Schaefer Farm?
Schaefer Farm, right.
Okay. And,
well, actually, the Falk Farm.
Okay.
But the Schaefers owned it.
And there was an old orchard back here.
That's right.
You may remember this, right after the war, they had an air show here.
Oh, yes.
And they brought airplanes in, and they were flying them in out of this place. And my dog and Blackie and I went hunting back here all the time. But the city limit at that time was where Silver Creek Road is right now. And the city limit didn't exist on the other side. It was still up at
Still farmers, right.
Gypsy Lane, what we used to call.
Gypsy Lane, which is Hartman Road.
Right. And so the backyard of the back of our lot was the country. And because we had been incorporated into the city right at the war time, none of the city services came out that way. We didn't have water or sewer or any of those things.
Actually, when they did make that available, it came out as a 3/4-inch main, which of course is nothing more than a hose.
Yes.
And it was still there in 1960. They have reconstructed that now so that you have the regular main, but at one time it was nothing more than a 3/4
I'm sure
inch
it was
line.
small. There weren't very many of us out there to service.
No, absolutely, surely. As a matter of fact, we had the Polks, who were right next door, and then go across Silver Creek Road, and you had the Makers on the corner, which is now where the gas station is. And then from there on, it was pretty well farmed too, until it went down to the pig farm, what we used to call the pig farm.
Well, Doc Terrell moved in there at some point.
In the 40s.
And created a veterinary place
Right.
that's still there, I think.
Yes, it is, but not Doc Terrell isn't there anymore, though.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the neighbors there. You remember Mrs. West, and you remember the Polks. Which of the Polks kids did you play with?
Gary Polk was my best buddy, and his son Roger is the one who runs the paintball show,
right.
and
Gary
Gary's
Polk.
very embarrassed by that.
He's embarrassed by it.
Yes.
Oh, Roger's very famous, absolutely.
I know it. He says all the old women like him.
All the old women like him. Well, fine boy. He's a very, very fine boy.
All right.
Then they had another daughter, Gilda Polk,
right.
and she would have been a little bit older than you. As a matter of fact, she's about 4 or 5 years older.
I think so.
And anybody else in the Polk?
That was the
Just had
Polk family.
The Polk family right next door. Then the West family had no children, did they?
Margaret West was my age, and she's still lives.
Oh, wait, that's right. They had a Margaret.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. That's right. That's right.
We call her Maggie. She lives over in Fair Lawn area.
Yeah, Margaret West. That's right. Now, who lived on the west side of West? The big house.
It was Tasler's was the name, and Tollett. There were two families, so a daughter Tasler and Tollett family.
It was a big house.
A big house, and later on, they moved to Columbus to live in an apartment. They had retired, and a fellow named Smith, who was an executive at Ohio Injector, lived there.
Or Salt.
I think it was the Injector. He
Was it?
Yeah.
But what was his first name? Hank?
I can't remember what his first name was. I mowed his lawn. That's all I remember.
Oh.
I should say something about what happened, why I'm here, because I left Wadsworth in 1956, and I'm Rip Van Winkle. I'm just coming back.
Coming back, right. But you've done a lot since then. Before we go into that part of it, I want to ask a couple more questions about your high school. You went to high school.
Yes.
And your horizons broadened in terms of friendships. Who were some of your best friends, and whom did you consider to be, well, probably some of your best friends today? I think it's extremely important.
Willard Houston, Och as we called him.
Willard Houston, of course, was a teacher here in Wadsworth.
And he's still here.
And why did we call him Ouch?
I have no, Och.
Och, right.
O-T-C-H. And I have no idea. He was always Och. He went to Lincoln, though, and I went to Central, so we didn't get to know each other until
junior high school.
Junior high school. Dick Delagrange was
Dick Delagrange, right.
He
had a sister also, did he not?
Yes, he did. And the McEntee boys, Jerry and Dick, and Mary Lou was in my class, and
Mary Lou was in your class as well.
Betty's still around. She's with.
Well, they're all four around.
Yes, Betty's Gehring now.
Gehring and Mary Lou is a Pisanelli, and one of them, Dick McEntee, is not married, and Jerry is married.
I understand Dick still lives in the family house.
Still lives in the family house at 154
Oh,
Fairlawn.
you're good at this. You know those numbers.
Well, you know, that I can remember, but unfortunately, if I'm talking to somebody right now and I turn my back, I ask myself, was I just talking to a man or a woman?
Okay.
I can remember the old things, some of the old things. A lot of things I forget. They come back, but that's the same way with all of us.
Well, some of the people in high school particularly were Marion Pisanelli.
Right. He's dead now.
Yes, and I saw him recently. He had changed his name to Mario at some point. And Ralph, his older brother, I guess.
He's living in Sheffield Lake.
And
Julius, his oldest brother, is living in Wadsworth.
And Tom Marin was, of course.
Tom Marin.
We played football together, and Gene Gossage and I used to beat each other up all the time.
And Gene Gossage was a formidable contestant to beat up, was he not?
Yes, he was.
Tell us about Gene Gossage's size.
He was as big as I was, and I was as big as he was, just about. And in the 7th grade, I weighed 225 pounds, and I was 6'1" already. And so Rex McIlvaine saw me walking home one day and stopped his car and gave me a ride to the football stadium to show me where I should be spending my time after school.
And did you?
Yes, I did. And I really owe it to Rex for getting me involved in that.
In the 7th grade, you weighed 225 pounds and 6'1".
Yes.
What does that say?
You can tell him now what I weighed when I was born.
13 pounds at birth.
And how much did you weigh?
12.
There you go.
And a half.
There.
12 and a half.
You were close.
And when I was in the 7th grade, I weighed 220 pounds, but I was only 5 feet 11.
Oh, really? Oh, so you were kind of. Well, the football, I suddenly went down to 190 pounds. That really got rid of that nice baby fat that I was carrying around. But Gene Gossage and I, starting in probably the 6th grade, just competed all the time to see who was the toughest guy. And we played for the same position, tackle in school. And so we were constantly beating against each other in practice and so on. And finally, I broke his leg. And
well, that wasn't very charitable.
no, but it got me first string on the football team. As many people probably know, Gene went on to play for Northwestern, I think it was, and under Parsegian, and is that right, Parsegian?
Era Parsegian, yes.
Yeah, and then went on to play for the Philadelphia Eagles. So I always felt that if I had stuck my nose in the right places, I could have been a Philadelphia Eagle or something.
There you go. Era Parsegian has a family that, I mean, he's a famous person, as everyone knows, but he has a family.
He was revered as a football coach at that time.
He was what?
Revered. I mean, everybody.
Revered, right, he surely was. But the unfortunate thing is that there's a genetic problem within his family. As a result, he has lost at least one grandchild and perhaps another one. They all have the same disease. It's one of those really, really rare things that no one. And several years ago, I was privileged to be part of a fundraising campaign for that. His kids went to Holborn High School. At that time, I was chancellor of Holborn High School. After I left the university, I went there for 1 year as chancellor.
How did they end up there?
Pardon?
How did they end up in Akron?
Well, he's from Akron.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. Eric Parsegian's from Akron.
Okay.
And
very good.
Yes, and he, let's see if I can get this right, his daughter's children were there at the time, so we had a great big fundraiser for this horrible disease. I can't even remember the name of it. And then a little later on, that one grandchild died, and I don't know about the other ones now, but it was just very, very, very sad. But anyway, Eric Parsegian came out personally.
Very good.
And spent time with us as we were trying to make this collection. And as I remember, that we collected a tremendous amount of money. We had a football game or a basketball game as one of the fundraisers, where the staff of Holborn High School battled the staff at WAKR. And there was going to be a runaway with the staff, you know, from Hope High School because they were, they had access to the gym floor and all these other things, and WAKR didn't. Well, that's not the way it worked. However, one of the persons who played basketball on that team ran into, you talk about breaking Gene Goss's arm, ran into
His foot.
one of the other players. Now, the one player who ran into the other player was not of the same gender.
Ooh. Okay.
They are now married.
Oh, okay.
So
well, that was a good
that
hit.
that was a good hit compared to the one that you're talking about.
Very good.
Tell us a little bit more about the friendships in high school and how they've continued and all that. Now, you had Och and you had Willard Houston, and who are some of the other ones?
Well, John Hanna was
John Hanna, of
was
course,
in our
he was the
class,
mayor.
and he was the mayor, and he's still very good friends. Really ran around with John Williamson, and he was he left. His father went to New York somewhere to work for General Electric, I think, and John went off to Rensselaer at that time.
Rensselaer in Troy, New York.
Right. And, but the three of us, Och and John and I, were very good friends in the Delagranges, in the McEntees.
And the Delagranges.
Yes.
Where do the Delagranges live?
I don't know. We've been tracking Richard down, and I think he's in
No,
Houston.
where did they live?
Oh, they lived, what is that street? Ohio or something?
Ohio
like that?
Avenue,
Yes, okay. Just went off.
And they had a sister also,
Yes. And,
Dolores Delagrange.
you know, I think in
And Dick Delagrange was your friend.
in my class,
Yes.
yes. And other people who are still in town, Walt Gehring was somebody
Walt Gehring,
who was in the Boy Scout troop with my brother, and
Walt is a couple of years older than you, but not much.
yes, and people like that. And I remember you.
Remember me?
You sang in the choir, as I recall, at the
That's right.
Sacred Heart Church, and I always thought you were going to be a priest, but...
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah, but when I told Linda that, she said she was happy that you didn't become a priest. And
I
so
can
are your
remember
kids.
Your brother John, and I sat in the same pew on one Sunday morning, and he whispered to me these words: "The Russians opened a second front." And I looked at him and said, "They did." I had the slightest idea what the second front meant. But whenever that was the day that,
Okay.
if we can ever find out when the Russians opened the second front, we will be able to determine what day that was that I talked with
Well,
your
he
brother
remembers singing in the choir with you.
John. Yes, John.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about these high school people and these friends, because they are all significant people, and everyone is significant. There are no throwaway people, but I mean, they're all in some way or another significant to your life, even today. They were all good friends at that time, and one of the things we tried to do on this program is to identify relationships and the relationship that you had. Can you think of any other ones? So far, each person has been a male and or a sister of a male.
Okay.
Any of those?
Well, I had a
female-
girlfriend.
Okay, now we're getting down to the
Okay. Iris Hoagland was my girlfriend.
Iris Hoagland, and her
Reen-
father was
Glenn.
Glenn Hoagland, who
Excuse me.
lived on Gypsy.
Gypsy Lane at that time, now Hartman Road.
Right.
And we had a lot of fun together. Wayne Hoagland is still in town.
Wayne
He
Hoagland,
lives
right.
out on Fixler Road,
Right.
has a nice house out there. Marilyn Miller was somebody
Marilyn
that
Miller.
I grew up with. And
Marilyn Miller's father was Mort Miller, who was a sign painter.
Yes.
She had a brother.
Rick?
No.
Mickey.
Mickey Miller.
And she married Jim Gordon, who
Right.
was...
And Marilyn has been the mainstay at the emergency room at the
Yes.
hospital for 100 years, and I've been trying to get her on the program, and I can't.
Well, she works 6 days a week or something
I
like
know.
that. We'll get her on the program. She knows everybody in town, of course.
Oh, absolutely.
And one of the first things that happened to us when we came back here, I'd been gone since 1956, and I've always taken a flu shot in the fall, and we belonged to Kaiser for many years, so I got a shot in Fairlawn at Kaiser at 10 o'clock in the morning. By noon, I was in the hospital here with a severe reaction to it. But who's the first person you meet is Marilyn. You know.
Did you recognize her?
Oh yeah, and we've talked before, but it's really pleasant to be able to have an emergency where you think you're dying, and then there's somebody like Marilyn there to.
Oh, she's great.
Really take
matter
care
of fact, that whole hospital scene is something, and no one likes to go to the hospital. But
No.
if you have to go to the hospital, that's the place to go.
It's one of the things when you're thinking about retiring and you're going to move someplace. One of the things you worry about is what's going to happen when the big one comes or something like that, and you want to have someplace nearby where you can get to. And I feel much relieved to have that hospital facility here.
Well, that gives me confidence to say what I'm going to say now. I built a new house 14 years ago, and the very first thing that I did was to make sure that the ambulance could get into the house by putting in 1-foot letters of my house number right at the road.
That's a good idea.
So they know where to come. Quickly, let's go through some more of your high school people, then we have some other questions about your family, and then we want to hear about what you've been doing because it's extremely important.
One of the people that was very influential in my life was Arnold Goldstein.
Arnold Goldstein. Tell us about Arnold Goldstein.
And he was very best friend. Many of my friends were in the class of '54, and I'm not quite sure why that was, but Arnold was one of those. And his father...
that was a class ahead of yours.
Yes, and Arnold's father, I'm not sure I know what his first name was. He was Mr. Goldstein.
Mr. Goldstein, of course, absolutely.
But he owned G&H Drugs, and there were the Hirsches also, I guess. I was the H and Goldstein was the G. And Rookie Hirsch was certainly one of those, was part of that family. Arnie was Jewish, and we didn't have a lot of Jewish families in Wadsworth.
4 or 5, that's about it.
And so, of course, they stuck together. His younger brother, Marvin, was also a good friend. But Arnold's father got me a job at G&H, where once I was being very active in high school and was involved in the student council and other things. He gave me a job where I didn't really have to work. I mean, it was whenever I could get there. Mm-hmm. And but it was a weekly amount of money coming in that would help. But Arnold taught me a lot of things. He took me off to Oberlin when he was going to school there, and he taught me about going to college and how to run a student council and all those kind of things. So
now, what is Arnold doing now?
Arnold's dead. Arnold died
in an automobile accident.
No, it was much more. He became he graduated from Oberlin, and he was going to medical school, and I think he graduated from medical school and became a flight surgeon in the Navy.
That's right.
And it was one of those freak things where they were taking off and the plane didn't take off, and it
was a plane accident, right?
Yeah.
And it was an accident.
And it dumped into the sea, and it was just a really tragic
horrible.
Because this guy really had lots of.
And what about his brother, Marvin?
Marvin is in Scottsdale, Arizona right now, and became a rather highly successful surgeon, heart surgeon, I believe. I had met, I went to Duke to get my doctorate, and Marvin was studying medicine at Chapel Hill at that time at University of North Carolina.
I ran across Marvin when my brother was dying in a hospital in Scottsdale. I went down there, and the young doctor came in and said, it was not my brother's doctor because my brother had cancer. And Marvin, I think, is heart, isn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he came in and he said, I'm covering or something for the, doing something here for Dr. Zonas. I can remember that name quite well, who was a throat specialist. And he said, your name sounds familiar. He said to my brother, where are you from? And my brother said, well, I'm from Scottsdale. No, I mean, where are you from originally? And he said, well, I'm from a little town in Ohio. Said, so am I. What little town are you from in Ohio? And he responded, Wadsworth, Ohio. He said, so am I. And here I was, you know, with
Marvin?
Marvin.
Yeah.
Of course, I had not seen him for years. As a matter of fact, he's considerably younger than I, so I didn't know him that well, but I knew who he was, of course. Who else? What teachers were the ones who were the most influential and what brought you to great success? We certainly have to get to that point of it too today.
Again, when we go back in these years, they're all Mr. and Mrs.
Right, of course.
They don't have first names, but Mrs. Gehring.
Helen Gehring.
Helen Gehring.
She's dead now.
She just died recently,
Yes.
I understand.
Helen Nichols when we had her.
Yes, and I was going to say Nichols. I thought she was just
Married Bob Gehring, who was the brother of Walter Gehring.
Yes. Is Bob still with us?
No, Bob died at age 42 with heart.
She was just, she taught Latin, and I think
French and
later French, but she didn't teach French at that
I see.
time. And so I took Latin from her, and she also encouraged me to go on to school. And well, that's another story, but she was very influential, and she was also the student council advisor and senior class advisor and things like that, and she helped us out a great deal.
Tremendous woman.
Yes.
Just admired her tremendously.
Miss Boffman was an art teacher, and
Doris Boffman.
Doris Boffman. We all thought she was very beautiful and elegant, and she
was that way when my oldest brothers were in school, and I understand that my children went there. Many, many years later, she still looked the same.
Yes.
She had to be in her 80s at the time. Well, no, probably not. But
I heard that she had married later in life, but she wasn't married at that time.
no, she was not. She was Miss.
Another was from a music teacher from elementary school was Hartman.
Miss Hartman.
Hartman, yes, and I understand she's still
Around.
very active. And
oh, yes.
I understand she wears a red dress all the time.
Yep.
She was very well pleased. There was a teacher called Miss King, Jane King, I believe it was, and she ran the drama and the speech contests. And I, of course, went to speech contests because Arnold had told me I was supposed to go to speech contests, and so I did those kind of things, and also was in the plays. And she was just extremely helpful in giving you lots of confidence that you can do things like that. One person you have to mention when you mention the school is O.J. Wirt. I mean,
Everyone does.
he was unbelievable.
He's probably the only person bigger than you were in this.
Well, I was thinking this morning that O.J. used to come out, and he had a three-piece gray suit. And
He always wore a gray suit.
And he had his thumbs in his vest. As he would. And it's if you know the old Central School, there was a balcony. I don't know if it's still there.
The balcony, the construction of the balcony was taken away. However, it was placed downstairs at the entrance of the school.
Oh, okay.
So that's still there.
Okay, but he would come out of his office and just survey the place. Like anybody out of order, you're going to hear about it. And
Or feel it.
yes. Keith Burkholder was another old friend, and his father was a superintendent. Keith had a lot of problems, I think. He was bothered by his father's position in the school, I think, and so he did a lot of things to make his father squirm, I would say, like, well, stealing a car and some things like that.
He became a radio announcer, did he not?
Yes, and he was in Phoenix. I saw him, and he was very popular in Phoenix at the time. And then I think he went on to St. Louis, and he died in an automobile accident later on. People like that died early surprised me. Guy Hall was a person running around, and a fellow named Staub, who his father owned the gas station. A Gulf station, I guess it was at that time. And a very good classmate was Carol Ann Harden, and she
died very early. As a matter of fact, they 19 years old or so. Yeah. She also lived on Ohio or Fairlawn.
No, that was another one. That was Paula Neath.
She lived on Paula Neath lived up on Bear, didn't she?
Yeah.
But Carol Harden lived out here on. She died by 18 or 19 years old, wasn't she?
No, I saw her at a reunion later on, but she did die young.
I thought she died
But
much
Paula
earlier.
Neath was another one who was, and we should mention her, I guess. She was a majorette as a kid.
Oh,
You forget-
healthy as a horse.
Yes.
Just died. Her brother was Joe Neath, very
Yeah.
popular in school, and her father was Joe Neath. He was at one time the head of the Republican Party in Medina County,
We won't.
and he claims that the only Democrat he ever voted for was yours truly.
He didn't vote for Don Merriman?
No, I don't think he did.
Oh, okay.
I don't think he did.
Okay.
Now, if we have time, I want to come back to some other questions here regarding this. But you left high school, and I believe you went on to college, correct?
Yes.
And I believe that you were the only one in your family that did, right?
Yes.
Now then, tell us of your meteoric success from high school to 2005, all the way from getting a PhD to being professors at various colleges, being an international figure, and so forth and so on.
Just started with one thing. Mrs. Gehring, as I said, was just a great influence, but at the time I was really, in high school, I was really into cars, and I had found that I could buy an old car, at that time, a pre-war car, paint it, and then sell it within a couple of weeks. They call that flipping now, I think.
Flipping, right.
Yes. But I was making money at it, and so I really learned with Gary Polk and I working on cars all the time. We really learned a lot about cars, and there was an opportunity to go to General Motors Institute, and I don't know if anyone knows what that is.
Yes,
but
my brother went to it.
did it? Okay. And it's very difficult to get into.
taught in it, as a matter of
Yeah.
fact.
And essentially, it's a cooperative program, so a poor person could get into that very easily and do very well. You work 2 months at a factory that you were assigned to, and then you went to Flint, Michigan for 2 months to study. And I had a position at Cleveland, Chevrolet Cleveland, and I did that for about a year and a half, and it dawned on me that the major people in General Motors didn't go to General Motors Institute.
Mm-hmm.
They went to places like Berkeley and Harvard and places like that. So, and just because I was reading a physics book and all the pictures were about University of California, I decided, well, I must go to University of California. And my sister Ann had moved to Los Angeles, and that gave me an opportunity to go to Los Angeles and enroll in UCLA. University of California, at that time, there was University of California was at that time just starting to expand, and that was still called University of California Southern Branch, and they had just changed the name to University of California, Los Angeles. And when I applied there, I applied for a scholarship, an alumni scholarship, and that waived, and I received it, and that waived the out-of-state tuition. And it's unbelievable now, but the out-of-state tuition in 1956 was $1,500 a semester. The in-state tuition was $65 to go to a place like UCLA.
Can't even buy a parking ticket for that amount.
Yeah, and so that was a major
Parking pass.
major thing. And I played football at UCLA. I also played rugby there, and realized that I was really slated to be an academic or a scholar, and that there was maybe a reason to play sports, but I'd like to play sports and have fun, and that's why I played rugby. It was much more fun than football was. Graduated from UCLA, decided I wanted to be a writer, and so I figured that the easy thing to do was be an English professor, and you could then, because all you got to do as an English professor is just read books, and and so and I could write, and it'd be a nice profession. And so even though I'd had several jobs as engineering, technical jobs, I decided I was going to become an English professor. And so I tried to get into Stanford because they had a good writing program there, but they wouldn't accept me. And Iowa also had a writer's program, and they accepted me. And And so I went there and I was studying creative writing. There was
As an undergraduate?
For a master's degree.
Master's degree, okay.
And I had traveled 2,000 miles from Los Angeles to get to Iowa City, and the graduate schools were filled with people from the East Coast, from New York and New Jersey, and they had traveled 1,000 miles and they thought they were out west, and they were wearing cowboy hats and jeans and things like this. I thought I was back east, and so the person, one of the people who was teaching at the place had just started teaching, and he hadn't really published anything yet, so many of us were very reluctant to take courses from him. And turns out later his name was Kurt Vonnegut.
Oh, really? Tell us about Kurt.
Well, he was not known at that time, and he was just a very good teacher. Everybody liked him. But actually, there was another teacher, Vance Bergeli, that I liked even better because he taught us a lot about William James, James Joyce.
James Joyce.
And we went through the stories and learned how to write from that. One of the things that happens when you go to a writer school like that is you learn to write, but if you don't have anything to write about, it's not, there's nowhere to go. And so the bars of Iowa City were filled with these people from the East Coast who were become writers, but they didn't have any experiences, and so somehow they were getting their experiences in the bars. And I decided I really needed something that would give me a broad understanding of American life, and so I included a second major in American Studies, in American civilization, and that gave me studying of art history and intellectual history and literature and some social studies as well. I did very well at Iowa, and up until that time I hadn't, other than the alumni fellowship, I had an NDA loan, and I don't know if people know what those are.
National Defense
Education loan. When Sputnik went up in 1957, there was suddenly this scare that we didn't have any education. We were falling behind in our education.
Let's make sure we have that straight. NDEA.
Yeah, National Defense Education Act. And it was passed about 1957 in direct response to Sputnik, this Soviet satellite that was shot up. And it essentially said that they would loan you the money to go to school, and then if you taught afterwards,
they forgave it.
Half of it. And so that was...
Oh, I thought they forgave the whole thing.
No, at that time it was only half, but that was fine. That was great. And that got me a fellowship to Duke as well. And at Duke, I was studying to get a doctorate. I became the, Doug Knight, he was the president of Duke, and I became his assistant. He was an English professor too, and he was always off someplace, so I would teach his classes when he wasn't there. And that brought I was very fortunate because I went to Duke in a Volkswagen. I drove out in a Mercedes-Benz, so I must have been doing something right. I couldn't have done that today at all. It would cost $30,000 or $40,000 now a year at Duke. But, when I decided I was going to be a professor at UCLA, I talked to my professors about what it would take for them to hire me when I got through, and they said you have to have an Eastern PhD. They didn't hire Western PhDs at that time. And
so Duke is as Eastern as you can get.
Right, and so they hired me.
A few more feet, you're in the ocean.
Yes. And
Atlantic Ocean.
So I went back to UCLA. I was hired back there.
And how long did you stay at UCLA?
About 10 years. And I was brought to Bowling Green State University as a visiting professor. They wanted me to create some interest in folklore, and that was one of my fields. And that's where I met Susan, my wife.
And what was she doing there?
She was a professor of popular culture technically, but she was asked to start the first women's studies program at
Bowling Green State University. What year was this?
It was 1975, and that was the first women's studies program in Ohio.
In Ohio. And Sue's last name was?
Don't call her Sue. She wants to be Susie.
Susie. Okay, Susie's last name was?
At that time, it was Tampie. That was her first marriage name.
T-A-M-P-I-E?
No, T-A-M-K-E.
Oh.
But her family name was Smith, and She was Susan Jane Smith, went to Smith College.
Susan Jane Smith from Smith College.
Right. They were from Wilmington. Her father was an engineer on the Manhattan Project.
Wilmington, Delaware, Wilmington, Ohio.
Wilmington, Delaware, worked for DuPont.
Right.
DuPont was known for explosives, and so when they wanted to create the atom bomb during World War II, they went to DuPont for most of their technical people. And so her whole life was, well, we met in Bowling Green, and we decided we were going to stay there primarily because I was starting to get involved in public television at Bowling Green. And at that point, we also, I had made some money in Los Angeles on real estate at a proper time. And
at the proper time, right.
And so, technically, I guess I retired and went on to teach at Summit Bowling Green, but also we started doing television production.
And then that was what year approximately?
That was 75 to 86. In 86, Susan was offered a position at Fresno State in California, and she had never had her California experience, so we went back to California. She retired there in 2000, and we started looking for a place to retire to, and we wanted a small town, we wanted a good library, we wanted to be a place where we could walk downtown, and Hotch called me up and said that there was another Young house for sale, and we had just about 2000, I guess it was, we had tried to save the Parsonage house that was a Young estate next to the Methodist Church on Broad Street, and we were going to move that somewhere, and the price got up over $450,000 to move it, and obviously it was easier to rebuild the house than it was to move it.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Now, before we go further here, tell us about what else you did in your retirement in Hungary.
It wasn't in retirement. Well, I was doing television, but I also had a Fulbright. It started, the first Fulbright was during the summer of 1990, right after the wall came down. It came down in '89, and they wanted to, Hungary wanted to have American scholars come over and learn about what the transition was from the problems that they were going through transitioning from Soviet control to a democratic state. And so at first Susan and I were part of 16 scholars who spent a summer in the summer of '90 in Hungary, going around to different universities. And out of that, I was invited to then get a Fulbright. A Fulbright is a program at that time out of the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Information Agency.
Named from Senator Fulbright.
Senator Fulbright. And we were supposed to go there for 1 year, and they renewed it for a second year. So we spent from 1990 to '93 in Hungary teaching.
Was it a coincidence that your ancestry was Hungarian?
No coincidence at all. I wanted to go there. I wanted to find out. And it was just a great time because we went to the villages where my parents came from, and we met lots of people, lots of good friends who still are very best friends. At both Eötvös Loránd, Tudományi Egyetem, which is the Hungarian name for Budapest University, also at Debrecen, and also at Szeged, the universities there. And we, as a Fulbrighter, you just try to expand the brief, as it's called. You try to expand what you're, when you get there, you find out what you really should be there for. And so I did a lot of art history in Hungary. The Soviets had declared that all modern art was decadent.
Right.
And so they were very hungry to see, excuse the expression hungry, but to see American art, and particularly Western art, modern art.
Now then, very quickly tell us also what the former students of Wadsworth thought of you, which resulted in a high honor.
Well, you were there, so you should know. What was it, 2000 or 2001?
1999.
99, okay. 1999, Wadsworth High School decided they would like to start a Hall of Fame, and Och Houston got in touch with me and said that he was going to nominate me for this position, and would I submit an application? I guess you did, or something. Send your vita in, I guess, and so I did that. And I was chosen along with you.
And one other person.
The professor from
Dr.
India.
Kreider.
Kreider, yes. And so we were, 1999, I came back to Wadsworth and got to see Caesar again, and realized that I really did want to, this was a nice town. I'd like to come back here.
So you're here now. Where are you living right now? We have just a couple of minutes left.
One of the other young houses, this, again, Och told me that this house was for sale.
On Woodland Avenue.
Woodland Avenue.
It was Irv Young's house.
Yes, and it's really beat up. And we're spending a lot of time. I'm working on the plans now for an addition that would, these old mansions were difficult to modernize because they had maids in those days, and they'd have a maid's quarter, and the maid would do all the cooking in the kitchen, or maybe a maid and a helper. And so today everybody wants to spend time in the kitchen and talk and have a family room adjacent to the kitchen. And so you really have to remodel these things to make them acceptable to. We've done many houses, restoring them and remodeling them, and I've never built a house, but it's always a challenge to see what you're given this problem, and how can you solve the problem. And we always look at it as the house itself deserves something, and the setting deserves something.
It's a beautiful, beautiful home.
Yeah, it's a beautiful home. It'll be even better when we get through.
When we're all through with it. Family members, have we forgotten anybody?
Not really. My brother Johnny lives in Colorado Springs now, and Agnes lives in Sacramento. We have two children. One is Monty, who lives in Sacramento as well. And our son, Alexander, we call him Al or Sandy, and he's in Phoenix. He's a lawyer there.
So, and what are the ages of Monty and Sandy?
Monty's 38, I believe, and Sandy's about 42, I believe. 42.
And Monty is a male, female?
He's male.
Male. And Sandy's a male?
Yes. And politically, they're radically different.
They're radically different.
Monty runs a gun store in Sacramento, and the other son is a lawyer who specializes in liberal causes.
In liberal causes, I see. Very, very quickly, we have just about less than a minute left here. Tell us one thing that brought you back to Wadsworth besides your wife.
The town. And
the town.
Also, we both, when we really decided we were retired in 2000, we decided that we've both been, Susan comes from a family that had privilege, and I realize now that I've got privilege, and that a lot of that comes from a town like Wadsworth that you grow up in. And so we were working with Habitat for Humanity in California, and we thought we would want to do something like that here in Wadsworth. The
one thing that we want to tell the entire group is that in a few weeks you'll be on again with your 50th anniversary, the 1955 class celebrating its 50th anniversary.
Right.
We're going to have you back with us as one of the people, along with some other people as well.
Okay.
Until that time, thank you so much, Joe. This has been wonderful to be able to get this bit of history about the Arpads. Thank you very much.
Thank you.